I appreciate the book you and your co-author have, or co-editor rather, have compiled. I am always a stickler for another Edmund Burke book. Good grief. Let me try that again. I am always a stickler for another Edmund Burke book, as he is, in my view, one of the most fascinating political thinkers in the past several centuries, anyhow. You focus on more than Burke, though. You often, and in fact, I think your specialty is almost more Adam Smith, David
Mhm.
Hume. I wanted to start off here with this whole Hume, Smith, Burke. In fact, you write in the introduction, Burke's economic thought was in line with Hume and Smith, and there was easy communication between them. I'm sure that's very easily defendable. The only thing I can think of off the top of my head was Burke's great antagonist, Thomas Paine, writes,
Mhm.
and I believe it was in The Rights of Man. He takes issue with Burke's views of Smith, claiming that Burke just doesn't understand Smith or something to that effect. I don't have the quote right in front of me, but I don't think it was universally believed that there was just complete agreement between Smith, Burke, and Hume. So, could you flesh out for us what, broadly speaking, do these three individuals represent as a cohesive worldview?
In terms of policy, imagine making policy as a lawmaker within a stable political system. I think they all three very much favored laissez-faire, allowing every man to pursue his own interest his own way. Smith also spoke of the system of natural liberty. Uh, so I think actually Burke was very much in line with that. That comes through most especially in one of his very late works, Thoughts and Details on Scarcity, where he talks about markets. And it's a very kind of hands-off government ruins market mechanisms kind of lesson with a lot of detail, also about farming and agricultural markets, because he had personal experience in those, and those were some of the issues, as well as labor markets, that he talks about in that. So when it comes to a general orientation towards the government intervening or not intervening, the government taking the lead in social affairs, in kind of new enterprises and new ventures, I think they're all of very much alike in seeing that government doesn't have its own correction mechanisms the way that voluntary association or a voluntary interaction does. The nice thing about voluntary interaction, including the market, is that if some people are dissatisfied, they refrain and they don't get then their trading or would-be trading partners don't get the funding, the participation, the support, whereas government doesn't work that way. Decisions are much more collectivized. Participation is often coerced, like through taxation, and so it makes for a whole different system of feedbacks, where they much more auto-correct, self-correct in voluntary activities and market activities, and that's not true in government, and that's why government is a very, very different realm. Now, I say all this with the premise of a stable political system, stable, functional political system. On that front, Burke is very reluctant to tamper drastically with political institutions, with the structures of government and the traditions and conventions that those are based on. And what I don't think people necessarily understand so well about Smith and perhaps even Hume is that I think they're basically of the same view. They're also sort of conservative when it comes to, if you will, polity issues, polity as opposed to policy, which is so it's kind of like more the framework of the polity and the character of the polity. And then within that, there's policy making, right?
And I'm
People,
sorry to ask you, would you, because I think we can get lost in the weeds very easily, can you
yeah,
distinguish between polity and policy?
yes. The idea is that polity is more the structure, the traditions, the conventions of government authority. And then the polity also is a concept that involves the governed, the subjects, if you will, or the electorate, if we're thinking about modern mass democracy. Um, so it's that whole it's the top polity being the nation state. Okay, so we're talking about Great Britain. for Burke's time. Um, and so that's a whole matter of it's not a voluntary system. Government is not a voluntary institution. He was not an endorser of social contract, by the way, just as Hume and Smith were not, which again I think shows a similarity between them on this polity front. But then within a polity, a kind of a functional, historically situated polity, you have, let's say, legislatures, and they are composed of legislators. And what did Adam Smith call the wealth of nations? The science of a legislator. So, in other words, now you have the legislator sitting within, if you will, this house of the polity, making policy for domestic purpose,
Hmm.
for policy making within, the house. And there, should we regulate butcher's meat, and should we have freer trade with Ireland, and so on and so forth? Should we tamper with wage rates? That's policy making within a kind of framework of polity, if you like, kind of a constitutional framework. So I'm saying that they on policy were really quite hands off, laissez faire oriented, but their attitude towards the polity, the structures, and tampering with government structures, institutions, conventions, they're much more conservative. They're reluctant to do drastic change. They like innovation in the market, but they don't like innovation or drastic innovation in political institutions.
Conservative in the sense, I mean, and unfortunately, these terms, conservative, liberal,
Yep.
evolve so much that it can be unhelpful sometimes, but it certainly sounds conservative in the sense of the antithesis of the radical, right? That it's the
Yeah.
contextually based that they would conserve the institution, whereas the radical would destroy the institution, presumably
Right.
build it back in some other image, but at the very least destroy it. And you have written in the book here, Burke outlines his belief that there are indeed reasons to alter the status quo. Chief among them are violations of natural rights. The rights of, and here we're quoting Burke, the rights of men, that is to say, the natural rights of mankind, are indeed sacred things, and if any public measure is proved mischievously to affect them, the objection ought to be fatal to that measure, even if no charter at all could be set up against it. Now, Burke, of course, his views on when exactly we reform and or change, when we abolish, when we maintain it, are complicated, and we'll get into those in a bit. But I wanted to hang out here on this concept of natural rights because your statement there that chief among the reasons that we can alter the status quo is a violation of natural rights, I think is something that an individual such as Thomas Paine may take great objection to and say that was my problem with Burke in the first place. He
Mhm.
denied the existence of natural rights, right? The French revolutionaries were saying, well, this guy is just, he's so proceduralist that he sucks the principles out of everything. So in what sense can we, how does Burke understand natural rights, and how perhaps does that differentiate from how others of the Enlightenment era would have understood them?
I think that Paine has a more simplistic, kind of rationalistic and absolute notion of natural rights. And he thinks somehow it can be like entirely preserved in every case, and kind of more directly enforced or implemented. Whereas Burke understands that Paine's whole idea, and if you like, Locke's idea of such natural rights, are very much emergences, emergent things within a civilizational context, and that it's only by virtue of, again, these polity structures, these governmental, these particular, you know, especially Northwestern Europe, uh, countries and places, that these ideas became crystallized partly by having an integrated polity like the nation state, where different, I mean, before you have integrated polity or stable government, you actually could have competing powers like lords vying, lords that are challenging and warring with each other, clans, empires, churches, other institutions like guilds, of course, international warring with each other. And the point is that you've got to accept that there's got to be this institutional basis for proceeding. And that's going to involve, first of all, government itself. Any kind of power like this does depend on coercion in the end. And so, right there, that's a violation of these natural rights, which Locke kind of accepted, but he kind of worked his way around and made out like that was all based on some kind of contract, voluntary contract, where people contract, as it were, to have the government take their taxes from them and so on, specifying certain terms and conditions in the Lockean contract to otherwise maximize liberty, you might say. I think all that is actually quite misleading. I know it serves a purpose. It serves several purposes, actually. So, in a way, it's a very tempting and powerful idea. But Burke's got a much more nuanced view about the context, the preconditions, if you like, for this high degree of individual liberty that Paine and he both value and both actually want. But Paine has, like, I think, a much more simplistic, rationalistic kind of mentality about it.
Well, certainly much is made of the fact that Paine and Burke are, in a lot of ways, on the same side of the question when it comes to the American Revolution or arguments about certain facets of natural rights. In fact, he writes, I believe this is in the Reflections on the Revolution, sort of in the opening, "You hope, sir," to the individual he's writing to, "that I think French deserving of liberty. I certainly do. I certainly think that all men who deserve it, or I'm sorry, all men who desire it deserve it. It is not the reward of our merit or the acquisition of our industry. It is our inheritance. It is the birthright of our species. By virtue of being, I mean that is the definition, right, of a natural right. By virtue of being human,
Mhm.
this exists unto us."
Yes, but it's not the kind of right that you just proclaim and you expect it to be like immediately decisive, like when you walk into the courtroom. It's just more complicated. It's more aspirational.
Hmm.
And kind of a matter of like we're trying to augment this enjoyment of this right. We don't demand 100% and anything else is a gross and an intolerable violation. No, we're compromised in real life as human beings,
Well,
fallen human beings.
well, certainly Burke is seems like so much of his career was a balancing act, right,
Yeah.
between competing interests or ideas. And I so it's interesting because if you take a statement like that, because you always have to add to it, you can just look at this and assume, oh, Burke and Paine are on the same page here, but there's more to it. And it
Yeah.
would seem that where Paine, and I'm not just trying to focus on Paine, I'll say the French revolutionaries, the Jacobins, the radicals, and certainly Paine wasn't the most insane of that lot. In fact, at some point they imprisoned him. Um, where they're seeing you can where they're seeing the way to these rights is through a rationalistic means that ended up causing them to dispose the monarch, in fact, behead him. It sounds like Burke is saying it's quite the opposite. It's within the institutions you have, though authoritative they may be, though they are squelching some of your liberties, if you will. That is the means to the full realization, or I shouldn't say full realization. That
Yeah,
is
the
the means
better
to
realization.
right to the embetterment of these natural rights. And in fact, you're tearing apart the very thing that makes these things sustainable.
He did not see that what they were doing and the directions they were moving would lead to a better system. First of all, he's very, very reluctant to like deeply tamper, much less overthrow a system, just because, that creates this horrible precedent about, hey, I've got a great idea about a new system. Let's overthrow it again. Um, but also just specifically what he saw happening and the rhetoric and the mentality, he called it a theoretical dogma. Um, he did not think that this would augment liberty as a result. It would not be an improvement at all. And he does want, like you said, betterment. It's so he just didn't see that this was promising promising at all. Back in 1756, he wrote this Vindication of Natural Society, where he kind of feigns being a kind of rationalist person, almost like an anarchist.
Hmm.
And it was kind of a spoof on that point of view.
I think a lot
And
of people took him serious, did they not?
some people did, even after he had said, when he put a preface on it subsequently in a year or two, or some years later, not long after it first came out, saying that this was basically a spoof and not to be taken uh, at face value. Even after that, some people still kind of insist that he really believed it at the time. And Murray Rothbard actually interpreted this book that way, which I just think reflects poorly on Rothbard. But the point is that Burke was really wrestling with this, more axiomatic and, if you will, rationalistic claim for natural rights versus a more institutional, historic, nuanced, um, I would say responsible approach to actually trying to maintain that kind of idea, but just understand that we got to do the best we can. It's not going to be something fully realized or anything like that.
I think it may be helpful too, because of Burke being this great moderator, I guess, in the sense of balancing competing ideas,
Hmm.
to keep in view, and I would be interested in hearing if you don't share this idea, that we could also misinterpret Burke to being Hobbesian, right? To just sort of natural rights are something we might aspire to and sort of hope for the best under the systems we have. If that system is despotic, if that system is completely arbitrary, abusive of its power, oh well, there's not much we can do about that. In other words, Burke, my reading of him is he very much advocated reform, and within the institutions that he wanted to respect and maintain, he was nonetheless, in some sense, a firebrand within those institutions. I mean, it's not as if King George thought of him as this sort of moderated force that always went along to get along, or serving certainly Hastings, or a number of other figures he kind of came up. I mean, he was in some sense almost a radical reformer within those institutions. Again, I appreciate your thoughts, but I think there's also that temptation to pull him into a Hobbesian direction of somebody who just can't ever countenance a
Yeah.
change.
No, he's far from just an apologist of the status quo and a defender of the status quo, like you say about the East India Company. He went vigorously against Hastings and the abuses of the East India Company, and therefore wanted to reform that institution greatly. He wanted Catholic emancipation in terms of expanding the franchise. He wanted kind of free trade with Ireland. He wanted to reform slavery and phase it out of existence to eventual abolishment. He was essentially, I would say, tacitly for letting America go
Hmm.
for the American, war for independence. He didn't come out and say that in so many words, but I think
It's kind of
that's
hard to
actually
say that when you're at war and you're in Parliament.
right, exactly. But I think that's the drift. So he's very much a reformer, but he distinguishes between reforming things and drastically changing things. Again, innovating deeply in polity matters, if you will. So he wants to fix the house. He doesn't want to tear down the house and rebuild the house. That kind of
And
thing.
I appreciate you saying that because I think a lot of this, the listener might up to this point being, okay, this is all interesting, but I have no practical application for anything you guys are talking about. I don't understand how this could be
Mhm.
actually used. He has some interesting ideas about this. And I mean, first of all, he charts out the difference in his view between change and reform.
Mhm.
And those words can, evolve somewhat. So I'm not necessarily stuck on saying, to a certain degree, we could say Burke was for change, depending on how we're defining it. But you have mentioned here in the book that a review identified four hurdles, rather, that Burke has, that just because there's an abuse of natural rights, say, that in and of itself is not adequate justification for just going in and changing things. And the four hurdles, and I'll mention them briefly here.
Mhm.
And here I'm these are your words, your summation of Burke's hurdles. First, he sees degrees in the importance of objects of public policy. He is not a monist, right? He doesn't believe in one thing by any stretch of the imagination. Second, even if the abuse is of an important object, not all abuses are abuse enough to merit reform.
Mhm.
Third, motives matter to Burke, and the mere existence of a great abuse of a great object is not enough to reform. We examine the motives behind that. And fourth and finally, before even thinking about reforming the institutions, look for a remedy within the existing institution.
Mhm.
Now we can dissect these, and I would be happy to do so. But what's interesting is you follow that with this statement that I think is very very apt. Burke sees the importance of persuasion in Reformation. The hurdles are not strictly defined. What counts as what great or important? How often must an abuse occur to be habitual, etc.? So persuasion is going to be necessary to apply Burke's four-part test. And this is where I think Burke gets really interesting because you can have, as you well know, multiple individuals who look to Burke as their lodestar for political thought who really disagree at what point a reform or change is necessary. Now, some of those I think come at it in better faith than others. Murray Rothbard, Woodrow Wilson, or some of those that I think we could easily say got Burke wrong. There are others that I think are trying, but they walk away with a very different idea. And so I'm since they're more contemporary figures, I'm not going to put you in the awkward position of calling out names today, but I'll just throw this out there. The Edmund Burke Foundation it lists chief among it as national conservatism as the organization they're vaunting or behind. National conservatism, by my lights, is almost the antithesis of the let's work within institutions. It's almost more of a let's use the power of government to bend it in the same way that the left has in order to redirect it towards a more conservative understanding of policies or culture, if you will. Again, I'm not sure what your particular views on national conservatism is. I'm not asking you to defend or deny them. I'm just saying that um, this idea, these four hurdles, I think, suffer from the fact that they're not defined. And they're not really
Mhm.
definable, right? I don't know how you could forever and always put something around. So I don't know if there's so much a question here. I'm sort of I want to open the conversation for these hurdles I think are important. But what do we do about this limitation that we can't always agree on? Well, what is important? What is an abuse? How far is too far?
Well, what we really hope for is practice and tradition to establish among players in those institutions to develop conventions, to develop norms, to maintain those norms, to respect those norms, so that they can feel their way in terms of those four hurdles and be reasonable and modus vivendi with each other. That's ideally, I think, what Burke is looking at and practicing. He was an MP for 29 years, right? And so that's a matter of kind of healthy political life. And I think he sees that, maintaining a fair degree of liberty depends on having a functional, healthy political system. And just that way, when if we think of our system today, our political system today as being, far away from that and failing terribly in that, I don't know what exactly the answer is and what Burke would offer as an answer given our current situation. But I don't really, if I think I follow you on the national conservatism matter, that they kind of want to do make use of powers in a manner kind of reciprocal to or symmetric to the way the left has. And that is certainly not a great way to get back towards some kind of functioning norms, modus vivendi among actual, politicos, policymakers, politicians, statesmen, whatever you want to call them. Um, so I have the same kind of reluctance about that you do, and I think Burke would too. Um, but I don't know. It's a hard. I mean, I'm not sure what there's great answers here. I'm pretty pleased that the Republicans did well in the recent election, and I'm hoping that something better starts to emerge and some corrections start being made, but I don't really know what we can hope for.
Yeah, but well, hope springs eternal in politics, I suppose. But
Yes.
and admittedly, it is somewhat of a broad and unfair question. I guess something I'm struck by is that there seems to be at bottom among the right, pardon me, and it's probably not fair to just put us in two different camps, but kind of a disagreement at bottom of where we are as a society in this present moment. Because, and I'm thinking, for instance,
Mhm.
Yuval Levin himself has told me I wouldn't know how to apply a Burkean model to North Korea. Like, what are they supposed to draw on from their past necessarily that would bring about these natural rights? Burke, I mean, and we can talk about this later, maybe advocated an almost 18th century D-Day invasion of northern France, to take over Paris. And I mean, that wasn't talk about a radical change, to in other words, he identified instances in which the abuses were so horrid that this sort of slow accretion of amelioration and negotiation that gets us to these natural rights just wasn't going to work. The situation was too far gone.
Well, let me
Yeah,
could
go ahead.
let's go on that just on the D-Day thing. I think that's something that Dominic and I we actually used as kind of a D in the letters on a regicide peace, which are like 94-ish, 1794-ish, written 1793, 94, I think they are. Um, you got to kind of, I mean, first of all, it's just kind of some passing remarks. It's not a very serious, developed suggestion.
Sure, sure.
But there is something there, and he's basically what he's kind of suggesting is a kind of counter coup because he sees the Jacobins and what followed them as a coup. And so it's not really like he wants Britain to take over France and nation build or something. And he doesn't see what he sees happening in France, from 1790 to 1793 is not really a normal politics and a give and take, but kind of like this constant turmoil, the reign of terror, and so on. And so I just don't want the listeners to understand that. I mean, what he's proposing is that, and it's floating the idea. It's not well
Hmm.
developed. Is like the Brits helping Frenchmen reclaim their their tradition and a restoration of what they had, more or less. It's not that he wants Britain, England to like govern France or take over France. It's just kind of like helping. It's like a counter coup and a
I,
restoration.
I appreciate your clarity there, yes, because and I guess D-Day would possibly be an apt term there, right? Because we were not trying to take over France. We were trying to liberate the French from their Nazi occupiers in a sense, because you get the sense that Burke was almost envisioning French people would welcome the Brits as liberators, not as
Absolutely.
conquerors.
Yes.
And it is granted toward the end of his life. I mean, we know that he is buried in an unmarked grave because he evidently at this point he thought the French were going to win, or at least that was at least a possibility that they could that the Jacobin spirit could sweep the United Kingdom also. And yes, no, I appreciate the clarity that I don't want to just leave in the mind of the listener he was advocating a invasion of Iraq, rebuilding a government style D-Day invasion. Um, but part of the reason I was saying that was, and I'm thinking here, I don't want to out her because I don't know what her actual views are. There's a very bright Iranian refugee who lives here in the United States, who's kind of been going on the podcast circuit of late, talking about her experiences growing up in Iran, and because of her viewpoints, and she's on the right, admittedly so, and so she's often finds herself on these podcasts. And what I found interesting is oftentimes these podcasters struggle with the notion that there is a difference of degree and kind between the atrocities of natural rights in the Iranian regime versus the excesses of, say, the left here in the United States. And often they'll point to things like, well, the Marxist understanding is, just as radical uh, as what the Iranian regime is up to. And maybe that's true of certain Marxists, but I am not of the belief that our government is controlled by actual radical Marxists. The reason I'm saying that is because and here I'm not I want to be careful because I don't know that everybody's always approaching this in good faith. There is a belief among the right, maybe not the intellectual right, but and maybe to a certain degree there is, that the situation here is so dire that it does in fact require a radical response, that it might even require another constitutional convention to set things straight, that it may in fact require us bending the rules within the institutions currently. And so I guess I'm kind of circling back around to those Burke's four hurdles. Presume that we can at least agree where we're at this moment in history. Is the United States at imminent risk of falling into some sort of a left-wing Marxist uh, despotism, or is the version of the left we're battling with the same we have for the last 100 or so years? Yes, they're dangerous, but they're just one of many viewpoints out there, and the entire system is not at risk of succumbing to radicalism.
I have a hard time assessing this as well. Um,
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'll try to ask easier
no,
questions from this point
I
on.
don't mind. It's fun. I am definitely deeply concerned about the modern world, without question. And when I look around at Canada, Latin America, UK, Europe, um, it's very, very disturbing. Had the Democrats prevailed in the election, I might have been thinking that we were just, and it's a much more of an international, if you like, globalist thing now.
Sure.
That's very different than I think in Burke's day. Very, very different. Um, s- uh, I would have been much, so I can understand like this deep pessimism and doubt about our future. As far as proposing or looking towards some drastic correction through a constitutional convention or something like a secession or breaking up of the nation or whatever, generally speaking, I think those visions of rectification kind of I mean, there's likely to be, contaminated and handicapped by the same general problem you're trying to solve, that I don't really have much hope that some drastic vision of such nature is going to be viable or work out the way you're envisioning it working out. It's kind of like the whole problem is going to um, infect that very drastic solution
Hmm.
kind of thing. So, I don't know
Yeah,
what the
yeah. I, I I will gladly pit the ingenious of the founding fathers against any assortment of intellectuals today.
oh,
To recraft a constitutional convention on more solid footing. Um, yeah, and I'm part of the reason I'm saying all this is because Burke himself was, as I mentioned, he was accused, and he knew he was accused of inconsistencies, right? Of on the one hand appearing to be this radical, on the other hand appearing to be unwilling to bend at any point. In fact, and I actually did not realize this. I'm kind of I appreciate in the introduction to your where he's talking about the letters from an appeal from the new to the old Whigs. Hard book to understand because he's talking in third person and occasionally talks as if
yeah.
he's from France. And so you're like, well, what's going on? So it's helpful having in your work, okay, here's what he's doing here. You say in this work, Burke refers to himself in the third person. He defends himself against claims of inconsistency. He says the Whigs have changed, not he. His appeal is like appealing one's case from one court to another. He wishes to have his case transferred from the court of the new Whigs, now corrupted and hostile to Burke, to the court of the old Whigs, those circa the time of the following the Glorious Revolution. And I kind of have a, maybe they're intertwined, but maybe a two-part question here. Gosh, if we can do this in a summary fashion, what is the difference between the old and the new Whig? And this is a conversation we had with Hans on a previous episode. Spent a whole hour discussing what actually that difference is. But second, and maybe related to it, Burke seems okay with the Glorious Revolution. And maybe it's unfair to say it just has the word
Yeah.
revolution in it because he was seen as such an anti-revolutionary or
Yeah.
contra-revolutionary. But how is the Glorious Revolution in keeping with his older Whig tradition, whereas something like, say, the French Revolution is breaking with that older Whig tradition?
Yeah, I can take a stab at this. I do want listeners to know that I'm not the strongest guy to answer this question, but I definitely have some thoughts to share on that. Right. So I Burke portrays the Glorious Revolution as kind of a correction and restoration, kind of that the Stuart monarchs, and particularly they had James II at the time, were were deviations from British tradition and understanding, and perhaps had designs to re-Catholicize the country, and involving perhaps foreign influences like France. Um, and so his view of 1688, 89 is not really revolutionary, but like restoration oriented or correction oriented. Um, it's probably, somewhat idealized to be sure, but that's generally how he's looking at that. And he sees the French Revolution as profoundly different. It's truly an overturning of French tradition, established tradition. Um, so the Whigs in Burke's time were mostly favorable to the developments in France, the revolutionary developments in France. And I think he was kind of shocked by that. And so when he came out so strongly against it with the reflections on the revolution in France, um, they were shocked by his denunciations.
Hmm.
And so this was part of what I think was like a growing rift between him and his fellow Whigs. Um, so he sees his modern Whigs in a way as becoming too rationalistic and also too like they're kind of buying too much into the idea of, oh, the more that we have a democratic system, the less we need constraints on government, and government is us, and we can us helping us. So, we should be able to do more. And I think he's in a sense, I think the modern Whigs are becoming more left wing in a kind of proto way, if you follow me. Um, and so he sees the old Whigs as more like the John Locke, Algernon Sidney kind of, kind of like Thomas Paine in terms of like really emphasizing individual liberty. Um, and so he sees them as having acted very responsibly back in their day, the ones who uh, brought on the Glorious Revolution. And he thinks that, he's really still like them, and the Whigs are changing, not that he's changing.
Hmm.
That's broadly. We recall that the title of his book, 1790 book, is Reflections on the Revolution in France. He didn't say on the French Revolution, because, as you noted, he saw it as a change in morals, spirit, outlook that wasn't specifically French. It was like a modern change that got its main foothold in Paris, in France.
Seems
And
like he
he
identifies it
saw,
as Rousseauian.
yeah, he sees Rousseau as very emblematic of it, influential in it. But the thing is, he is very concerned about this being a general phenomenon through Europe. And so it's a revolution that he's commenting on so far in France,
Mm.
because he sees it as this kind of new ideological force. He actually analogizes it to the Reformation of like a new religious. I think he'd call it quasi-religious because it's not really religious, the way Burke was. Um, um, and I think he thinks the new Whigs are somewhat infected with this mentality, like they're too vulnerable to it. And I think he was right, actually.
I obviously think Burke was right also, but I'm curious about, because you mentioned the phrase the Glorious Revolution was somewhat idealized, or Burke had this interesting way, and I on the one hand I can kind of respect and understand what he's doing. On the other, I wonder if it made him more vulnerable to his opponents than was needful. One of the things he's most criticized for in Reflections on the Revolution in France is an almost godlike worship of Marie Antoinette, right? Where
Hmm.
the French monarchy, that it was, what does he say, 1,000 swords would have been released from their scabbards
I
if,
love that passage.
yeah, it's beautifully written. Like, I mean, he's a good writer, and you can see where he's trying to evoke feeling of French patriotism, or like a notion of
Yeah,
honor,
gallantry too. Uh,
gallantry too, right? And but it also seems that he has, and maybe it's not fair to say he has. It also, I think, makes him vulnerable to attack of those who are more rationalistic or saying, "Are you kidding me? This is like this clearly." He is so blinded by the pageantry of all this that he's lost the plot. He is, and so I'm,
Mhm.
and I say that in effect because, as you mentioned, like the Glorious Revolution, sometimes he says stuff that I'm not saying he doesn't believe it. Don't get me wrong. I think he's almost speaking. Well, actually, now that I think about it, it's almost like he's in your book. You talk about, or rather, you quote him talking about how Hume himself had identified Rousseau's writing as there was no mystery, there's no mystic, there's no magic left. And so he has to rely on these more baser desires or instincts of humanity. It seems like Burke is consistently trying to, for lack of a better way to put it, reinvigorate the magic, if you will,
Yes.
to call us beyond just a pure rationalistic kind of Bentham, this is what works idea society. And on the one hand, I completely celebrate that, while on the other, I think it's needful we recognize if a person is not, if a heart has been cold to that fleshly kind of humanity, it can look odd. I don't feel like I'm fleshing out my thoughts here very well, but I guess
No,
I'm saying
I
there's a way. It's almost like you have to reach a person's humanity before they're accepting of this sort of Burkean framework.
absolutely, and I think he's really glorious in this respect. He's very philosophical and poetic. He's both a statesman and a real thinker, and he straddled both of those roles really quite remarkably. He started off doing more like thinking, kind of like a philosopher, and then he got more into politics, but he always had like this really strong philosophical bearing. And he does have a philosophical view about, first of all, it's a theological view about us being creatures of God and having kind of as it were, a covenant with God, a responsibility to God, which does have social terms, but his thinking on all of these matters, I think dovetails very well with Adam Smith, where it's a relational, spiritual mediation of all moral reasoning and responsibility, and so we do need first we need spirits, just like Adam Smith spoke of your conscience as the man within your breast. So that's like another being that you have a kind of then therefore a relationship with, your conscience. Your conscience is a representative of the impartial spectator, which in its highest sense goes up to God. And so your conscience is a representative of God. And then you look to people who you believe are better guides for your conscience, who you might kind of absorb, incorporate into your conscience. These are exemplars in your life, people who represent things, people who influence partly by force of their judgment and personality. And he says that social life and institutions are embodied in people, and that we should develop these sentimental, emotional, even passionate reactions to fates of people, actions of people. And so there's a certain allegiance we should feel towards our political leaders. We should be trying to work with them to make things better, or at least less bad, like even if we're not happy with them. And so when we see someone like Marie Antoinette, who I think he had a very positive, view toward, I mean, nothing terribly negative. I think she's gotten probably a bad rap from a lot of people. Um, being terribly abused and everything else. He has this fantastic, and he doesn't hold back. He is projecting his own personality and his own judgment to make it very clear that he's not like the new Whigs. He is reproving not only what is going on in France, but these people who are kind of going along with it and even
Hmm.
cheering it. And he's saying, no, I'm not like that. And so he just saw that I have to go out on a limb just to make clear like what my attitude is to all of this and to their, in a sense, complicity.
And I guess what I'm saying in part is, I mean, Burke is obviously very intelligent, knows his audience, can use discernment in the way he's communicating. My limited understanding of the populist view of Marie Antoinette among the French general speaking public was almost conspiratorial, right? She's this foreign operative that is, to some ill defined degree, to blame for all of her misfortunes. And she becomes sort of the figurehead, almost more so than the king himself, of the abuses of the monarch. And Burke comes into this almost, and again, I'm not accusing him of this, but it almost from a certain vantage point appears a clumsy, um, because if you have that sort of conspiratorial view of the queen in mind, and then here comes someone else talking about her in almost a godlike status, it seems like you necessarily need a precursor of saying, look, I acknowledge your concerns. Here's where I see them different. And in fact, we ought to be directing more your allegiance to the queen, and there are things to be admired about her, and you owe her a duty of loyalty and admiration. Um, it just it's so jarring, I guess, the difference between
Yeah.
where he presumes the French would be. Now, granted, if he's talking to
Yeah.
somebody like he was talking to you and I don't have a huge opinion, negative or positive, of Marie Antoinette. I have an opinion, but it's not like it's not like I'm going to get personally offended if somebody had something positive or negative to say about her. And so I'm not saying I'm objective perfectly, but I don't have as much emotion wrapped into it, and I can read that passage and be, oh, I see what he's doing here. I think I find it odd that he's doing this to a crowd that he has to know is going to be extremely hostile to that message.
I think that's right. But rather than trying to ingratiate himself or sidle up to them, I think he's trying to inspire like a different kind of guy and a different kind of wing, if you like, or faction or group to like rediscover this more what I think he considers a more proper attitude here of like how can you let these thugs abuse this woman
Hmm.
who actually is, probably a lovely woman with actually, I probably nothing bad, so, particularly for people in those kind of positions. Everyone can have disagreements about certain moves people make, but his impression was that she was quite a fine woman. But regardless, it's just like this terrible thuggish, uncivilized abuse. And he's trying to appeal to a different group of people to inspire a whole different mentality. He's not trying to bargain with those
Gotcha.
other folks. I think he wants to reprove them, like condemn them.
That makes sense. So he's speaking to those to the manly French, I guess, if you will, who have those
Yes,
virtues, and I mean manly in the old-fashioned sense of the word, who have those sort of chivalrous
yes,
virtues of courage and gallantry and honor.
absolutely.
Yeah, because he presumes that they still exist in mass in France in spite of
Yeah,
this other
and
group that has taken over.
as well as in Britain, it's not just a national. It's just generally speaking. And he's saying Western political success depends on these kinds of attitudes, manners. He's very big on mixing manners with politics, and he judges politics by manners. He judges a person's politics partly by that person's manners.
Can you can you unpackage that just a moment? Because I think we might have a more clumsy understanding of manners collectively here. It's presumably what Burke means by manners is not uh, proper table etiquettes or
Mhm.
things of that nature. How would Burke understand manners?
Yeah, more broadly, a broader sense of proprieties in context, in interaction, an understanding of circumstances, traditions, institutions, customs, norms, whatever the particular setting is, um, ways of arguing and reasoning. Um, and so he saw the French revolutionaries as quite monstrous in these respects. He saw Rousseau as quite monstrous, and I think quite properly.
Hmm.
I think Rousseau was quite monstrous in his personal manners, in his personal interactions, generally speaking, and in his writings, which I think are very kind of unmoral or immoral, basically. Um, so he was seeing, who was driving things in France and partly judging them on that basis. And I think very properly. And I feel the same way about the left today. Not necessarily, the Democrat next door, don't get me wrong, but kind of like the elites of the left today, I think have gotten quite vicious. I think a vicious tail has kind of wagged the party, actually.
When you mention elites, the book, as I was reading through it, had a quote from Burke I had not encountered before. I thought it was very interesting because it seems like it's almost a proto-condemnation of a kind of Woodrow Wilson rule of the elites mindset. And I'm quoting Burke. He says, "When men are too much confined to professional and faculty habits, and, as it were, inveterate in the recurrent employment of that narrow circle, they are rather disabled than qualified for whatever depends on the knowledge of mankind, on experience in mixed affairs, on a comprehensive connected view of the various complicated external and internal interests which go to the formation of that multi-fascist thing called a state." That's a highbrow way of saying, if I can kind of muddy the waters a bit, or maybe maybe Americanize it, that when you have individuals who are the professional class, if you will, the elites, the highly educated.
Yeah.
It's not that he was down on them necessarily. It was that they had a narrow view, that they lost touch with what it actually meant. I mean, what is that phrase he says? Something to the effect of, um, talking about when we're discussing how to feed the nation, I would much rather talk to a farmer than a metaphysician,
Hmm.
or words to that effect. Like, let me talk to the guy that's actually doing the work rather than what's just theorizing about it.
Absolutely.
Now, Burke himself was a brilliant theorist, so I don't think you could just say he was anti-intellectual, but he did seem to have this sort of clear sense of a, a pure rational scholarly class can be misled and almost get too
Yeah.
too far off on their own. So I guess I'll throw that to you and ask in conjunction with it. What then would, because presumably Burke is not saying, okay, well, what we need is a populist uprising of the yokels just sort of take over, who don't actually know what they're doing. They know how to farm, but they don't understand the complexities of international trade. What is Burke advocating for your ideal statesman?
It's as far as the connection with the farmer and so on. He believes in a certain. He's got a great regard actually for kind of the normal life person, the normal person, and the senses, the common sense of of those people. So I think he definitely feels that you should be in communication with them, be respectful. They are us, we are all kind of common human beings. So he's against any kind of elitism or supremacism that way, and he understands that their interests and sentiments are what you are responsible for. That's what you are to make better off, as it were. So you better be in communication with them. Um, at the same time, I definitely think he believes in the statesman, the MP in his case, member of parliament, exercising his own judgment. In fact, he has a famous statement about that in the to the electors of Bristol that says, "Look, I'm not here to represent your interest, to hear what your interest is, and just to do what you want me to do. Like even if it's like a clear majority of the people of Bristol." I am here to exercise my judgment as a member of this nation. as a member of this parliament. This parliament is making decisions for the nation. And it's not a national, there's sense in sort of America first, England first, Britain first, because that's where we're more effective. We're better informed, and we have a better chance of improving things because we are in communication, contact, intelligence in those spheres. So that's where our responsibility lies. And so he's saying, I am here to exercise my judgment, but of course, I am doing it on behalf of you and people like you actually around the nation. If you don't like the job I'm doing, you'll decide that the next election.
Which unfortunately they did.
Yeah, was it Bristol that he lost, and
I
then
think it was Bristol. Yeah, it's a beautiful quote, and I think he's completely right. And unfortunately, his constituents were like, "Yep, yeah, I guess we don't want this guy."
yeah, yeah. Well, it was a great statement. Um, but there's no way to sum up what he wants in the Statesman. It's not formula, it's not technocracy, which I think is in a way is what you were describing, where
Yeah,
these kind of
yeah.
technocratic tools of political interests and so on kind of provide the rationales for different directions and policy, and they are really the tools of often. Um,
Well, yeah, and sorry, just to pause there from. I
yeah,
think maybe the simplest way to say that is that technocracy I think presumes there is a right or correct
yeah.
policy, which seems to be something that Burke was says there is no such thing as a this is right, this is a wrong policy, full stop.
Yeah, he wouldn't believed in that kind of magical technocratic thinking at all. I mean, he thinks, it means a lot to be informed and to be in touch and to be knowledgeable in details and circumstances and histories. But the idea of making it kind of scientific, I think, would have repelled him very much.
Sorry, I may have caused you to lose
No,
track.
no.
But it sounded like you're saying there may not be I mean, I know at one point he quotes this would be my example of the ideal statesman, and I say that and I cannot remember the quote off the top of my head. But it's
Mhm.
probably true to say that you couldn't completely sketch one out, probably because I Burke regarded, so far as I could tell, politics as an art, not a science. There was no
Yeah.
true way to say write down for all time this is what we need. But it is something that can still guide us.
Yeah, he's definitely an art kind of person. That to some extent goes back to one of his earlier philosophical works, um, philosophical inquiry into the sublime and the beautiful, which is a very interesting read. It's not super systematic, but basically the distinction that, as I understand it, between the sublime and the beautiful is a bit more of a kind of a sense of order, almost as though you're looking down on something and you see the beauty in it, you're kind of satisfied with it. And it gives you a certain kind of security almost that you're beholding it and it's pleasing you. Um, Kind of a looking down kind of posture, whereas the sublime is quite different. It's it's something more awesome, more awe-inspiring, and
Hmm.
something you look up to, is that you don't fully comprehend, that you're kind of attracted to become part of, to belong to, and in that way participate in it, in that way kind of elevate yourself because it's big and you're looking up to it. But it can become rather terrifying and cause trembling, and you kind of make your mouth open. It's more like a kind of devout kind of experience. And so, yeah, he reflects on this. So he reflects about the sentiments of. So he really is about the art of life, including the art of politics and manners in this broad sense, morals, as a kind of performance art and a something you to do properly,
Yeah.
virtue.
Yes, and it is Burke's complicated. There's a lot you can dive into. The book you had co-edited here, Edmund Burke and the Perennial Battle from 1789 to 1797. Seven,
Yeah.
excellent book. It kind of encapsulates his. You do us all a favor by taking snippets from that part of his life to kind of drill down
Yes.
sort of a cohesive narrative throughout, which unfortunately with Burke sometimes you have to do to completely understand. Um, Before I let you go, I just want to give a guest an opportunity to shout out. You can get the book at Amazon. I'll link to it in the show notes. But as far as yourself, is there a blog, or do you do any writings, or is there anything that you would want the listener to be aware of if they want to follow you?
No, I don't have a blog and anything that particular, so don't worry about that. I do recommend the book. Um, I wish it's a book that it takes snippets, kernels, gems from this late period when the French thing, the revolution in France hit, and all of a sudden he went into this mode which was just on fire and remarkable. And it gathers these nuggets which if you tried to access by going to the reflections or going to the letters on the regicide piece and so on, you'd have to wade through, slog through so much stuff that's very hard to understand and now dated and so on and so forth. And so this book really, I really wish this was a book that someone had done 220 years ago because I think it would have captured this very, very special thing about Burke in his late years that is really worth admiring.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dan, I am always down for a conversation, a thoughtful conversation with Edmund Burke, and you were certainly a thoughtful, well-informed individual here. Thank you so much for that, and thank you for taking the time to come on the Save an Elephant Show.
Thank you very much, Josh.